Hi, everybody, and welcome to today's Sifted Talks on global payroll. I'm just going to give it a couple more seconds as we're just waiting for attendees to connect to the Zoom audio. Okay, so welcome, everyone. We're going to be discussing the complexities of the global payroll market, especially when it comes to expanding internationally, understanding country-specific regulations, and paying remote workers and freelancers. Our panelists will give their insights on how you can approach these challenges and also put a solid payments plan in place. So on my panel today are Robin Gandhi, Chief Product Officer of Nium, Sabrina Castiglione, Chief Operating Officer at Pento, Marcus Schunemann, Founder and CTO at Lano, and Marcelo Lebre, co-founder and COO of Remote. Just a few housekeeping things. So just wanted to let everyone in the audience know, we won't have a dedicated 5-minute Q&A at the end of the session, so I'll be taking questions throughout. You can submit these questions through the Q&A function, and we'll discuss the ones that are most popular. Cool. So we'll kick off then. Just putting first question out into the ether. What are the most pressing challenges when it comes to international payroll?
Maybe I can take that from the beginning. Well, I think it's as you already said at the beginning, it's figuring out how to employ and then also how to pay at the end. So it really depends on the country itself, on the employment type. And at the end, for sure, also like how you shift the funds through your entity, direct payments to freelancers, or through platforms like a Remote or Pento. So I think it's really challenging, but also interesting to see how it evolved in the last years. That these platforms, including us, giving the opportunity to really consolidate this data, but also to give the tools on their hand to expand on a global scale.
Yeah, and when it comes to kind of moving money around, as you put it, how can companies make sure that they're being compliant? What teams or structures do you have to have in place as a company?
So one of the biggest issues around this topic is fundamentally the fact that, you know, there has been a perception and up until recently of two things. One is, well, payroll is payroll, meaning that people think, well, payroll is very similar everywhere, and that payroll is just, you know, a payment that you do at the end of the month, or, you know, you agreed on a certain salary and you process it, and then that's fine, until you realize that every single country has completely different set of rules to calculate payroll, and that even adjacent countries, often misconstrued as being one, like Portugal and Spain, for instance, have, you know, worlds of difference between, you know, what a salary is defined, even at the light of the law. With that comes, you know, the complexities of, you know, funding that payroll, making sure that, you know, everything is taken into consideration as far as your obligations as an employer, or someone, you know, responsible for the well-being and the wealth of someone that is working with you. And then ultimately as well, respecting the boundaries of the labor laws and helping also push that into a more futuristic approach, which is literally what we're all trying to do every day. And that creates a scenario where, of course, one, we're talking about, you know, the rules of almost rules of engagement and how you deal with getting people paid in those in those countries, but also at the same time, how do you stay compliant in countries where regulation changes once, maybe twice a year, and how do you keep up with that? And so one of the biggest challenges is, as a company that is hiring globally, you know, Remote is literally remote from day one, for instance, and, you know, we're over 1,000 people across the world. We became our very first best and more aggressive customer, because there has to be this sort of layer across the world, and it doesn't really matter where people are. It should not matter where people are. And so it becomes almost like a first step. Remote work was a bit of a step into the future of work, but now, people know that they work remotely, but how do we process this? How do we go to government and say, hey, by the way, welcome to the future? It's not the 1800s where payroll is just a number at the back of an envelope.
I think to take a step back from that, and what are the challenges are around payroll. To Marcelo's point, the experience of work, certainly if you're in like a professional industry where it's some kind of knowledge or desk work, the experience of work is becoming fairly, not standardized, but similar globally. A developer in Portugal and a developer in the UK and a developer in the US probably have a very fairly similar working experience. However, the payroll experience is not necessarily the same at all. And this is also just, a challenge for finance and people teams kind of taking a step back as to, if you are hiring in multiple jurisdictions, you cannot simply assume that the homogenization of a practice that you can apply for like a company's global working practices can also apply to payroll. And I think there are lots of different ways to approach it, and we've got people here from companies solving it in different ways. And I think part of like the considerations are, do you have critical masses in certain areas and hubs? Are you fully distributed and remote? And I think a lot of these sort of bring up the questions of, from that step back, what is the experience you want to create for people, and how important is that homogenization of experience across your company?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing I would also say is, right, like when we think about how we pay for stuff ourselves, right, it's easy to homogenize and say, hey, everyone just will pay with a Visa and MasterCard and that will be it. But we all know that that's not the truth, right? As soon as you get into other countries, the way that we want to pay is different, and the way that people want to also get paid is going to be intrinsically different in every single country. And I think that's what makes it really interesting to have this conversation, because there's all of the things that you need to think about from a regulatory and compliance perspective, but then it's also, okay, well, what are the rails that get people their money? How do people like to receive their money? Some people like it in their bank account, some people like it on a card. I think as soon as you start thinking about all of those pieces, then it gets even more complex. So yeah, no, I think there's a lot of things to think about when we think about global payroll.
There's to that point, Robin, I think what earlier, like super early days, when remote was like 3-4 people, and we were across the world, and all of a sudden you need to pay someone, you need to send someone money for whatever, be it an expense, by a computer, and things that we take for granted, as you said, like using a Visa, MasterCard, or wiring money. The basic things of, okay, the money didn't arrive, we need to follow the money. And so from that point on, is like people calling banks that call banks and that eventually say, well, this is sort of in the SWIFT network, we don't really know where the money is, unless we get this super outdated extract of processes, which take weeks or months. Meanwhile, someone was waiting for the money.
Plus, yeah. Marcelo, on top here, it's also like traditional banking or traditional bank transfers for salaries are super expensive, right? So just like I said, like I started, or I work with distributed teams since a long time already. In my prior companies, we had a lot of the team in Ukraine. And as it's like kind of private entrepreneur setup there, you still have to transfer the funds, let it be in USD or in Euro. And at the prior company, it was actually already a problem that it got super expensive. And then maybe also the FX fees at that moment were not in your favor. So just to solve already that part, to put it on autopilot, to transfer these funds, I think that's a big advantage that companies can solve nowadays.
What would you all say are kind of common compliance mistakes that that companies make that they should probably be aware of before embarking on paying people across the globe?
Ignoring the fact that let's just discuss payments. If we ignore all the compliance side of things, let's just within the payment, the money is wiring someone money and expecting that precise money is going to land exactly in their bank account. Like this, to most people is like, oh, if I wire $1,000, why wouldn't people get $1,000 in the other end? Because there's this magic network of banks all through and through that will have its percentages and fees and magic hops that does not guarantee that some money will just get there how you'd hope it to get. And let's not even talk about FX. This kind of very basic example is still very, very common.
I mean, and to go to that compliance questions, I think a good example is, I mean, as you can hear, I'm from Germany, and it's misclassification. So if you hire someone as a freelancer, for example, in Germany, but he works like for months just on your project without any projects beside, the government will take it as a misclassification, and you have to repay all the social money, like everything beside. You kind of have to repay as he has been a full-time hire. So all these local laws you have to consider if you hire someone. And therefore, you also have this kind of 3 different types. How we call it internally, you have this kind of contractor management, you have the EOR model where you hire without an entity, and then you have the classical payroll where you have a local entity and you just run the payroll. But I think it's really important to mention that it really depends to the country where you want to hire. So you need the guidance a lot of times to make sure that you are compliant with the local labor laws.
Yeah, I think to just summarize the biggest mistake, and it's not a specific biggest mistake, but the biggest general mistake is assuming that whatever country you're hiring someone in will have similar labor and tax practices to the place that you're in. Especially if you're coming from a company that is mainly domiciled UK, US, where, the differences between the two are, they exist, but they're quite well understood. And usually you can get a lot of the same outcomes within the same framework. And then to your point, going and hiring in some of the jurisdictions in Europe and understanding that all of these things are different, from whether or not you can even have something like a notice period to what a contractor is and isn't, all the way through to rules around, the length of contracts that you can have. There are some jurisdictions where indefinite employment contracts, which are extremely common, say in the UK, are just not really a normal thing. I think someone said it earlier, I think it might have been you, Marcelo, the global employment law and tax institutions are very, very far behind how quickly working practices have become much more similar, with much more standardized expectations across the globe.
But how can, with all these kind of like mounting difficulties with compliance and tax and employment law, how can companies actually navigate their way through this? Like, what teams do they have to have in place? What structures do they have to have in place? Who's in charge of what? What advice can you give?
So it depends a bit. There's 4 of us that one way or another help get rid of all these headaches. Now, considering that the smaller companies, if you're starting a business, of course, it is not worth it for you to go through the hustle of trying to understand every single thing in every single country. Of course, when you're employing or paying someone with a contractor, whatever, even if you have your own entity and just processing payroll, it's important to understand the rules with which your employees have to deal with on a day-to-day basis. Because at the end of the day, you are the person responsible for their work. Now, ultimately, they're also, the companies grow in time. And when they reach a certain size, you want to start taking control of your workforce. Maybe it's financially more viable to have an entity in a certain country in a certain way, and depends in the world, of course. But you need to understand exactly all these topics from our own experience going all across the world with every single country having to be fully in-house. What we know is that you need to master literally all things payroll, all things benefits. So not just the salary, but the perks, the healthcares, the plans, the pension plans that come with it. In every single country has their own detailed plan on this, so it becomes a big thing. And you have a big work around tax and finance implications around all this. And of course, we're talking the bare bones of this high level, and typically bigger companies that really want to scrutinize every single dime and optimize for their own operation. These are typically the ones that, without it, you run a really big risk of getting, a knock on the door from the authorities and having a bad Monday. And so, at least from our perspective, these are the must-haves.
Yeah, and I think to your point, there's a critical mass argument here, where if you have one person in each of 50 companies, the most important thing is that you can get like the basics of everything across all of those companies to just maintain compliance with the lowest possible overhead. And that's where, services like Remote and Lana are like absolutely excellent in like helping simplify those services. Usually what we see is that once a company reaches a certain critical mass, maybe depends on each company and what activities they're doing in a geo, but maybe it's 50, 100, 200 people in like a particular place. And to Marcelo's point, you may want to start taking more control of your interaction for that specific entity and how it interacts with the relevant like labor and tax authorities. And also something that you sometimes see as businesses kind of become larger is you actually want to not just deal with mitigating the risks of compliance, but actually like taking advantage of some of the tax efficient schemes in like a given country. And this often sort of adds like an extra layer of overhead or specialisms or advice that's needed. But I think like the critical mass argument is like a certain point. Like there comes a time when you are so embedded in a particular country, especially if you have like a hub and spoke model, that often there is something to be gained by understanding that jurisdiction a bit better. But obviously for like smaller businesses trying to be as distributed as possible, that's potentially a risk and an overhead that could slow down a number of other things in your business and not really be where you want all of your people spending time.
I mean, but inherently, I think this is the beauty of what all of you are doing, right? I mean, we're providing the infrastructure for moving the money, but I think what all three of you are doing essentially is like being able to take advantage of this moment where now you can hire people anywhere in the world, right? Like I've noticed it, regardless of whether I'm at a small company or a big company, there's a lot of times that you see talent. Before COVID, you would see talent in a certain region and you would say, okay, it would be great if I could go get that one person, right? And then you say, there's no way I can do that because I don't know how to onboard someone there. I don't have an entity there. I have no idea how I would bring that person on to help me with how I drive my business. And I think now that the world has completely changed in terms of how we think about workers, sometimes it doesn't even matter. And I think that's the reason that we've seen such a massive uptick with companies like yourselves that are helping others get into markets that they never could have to hire workers there. And I think that's pretty impressive. And it'll be interesting to see where this all goes. But I mean, I think the workforce has just completely changed. And that's why this is such an interesting conversation for probably everyone that's listening as well, And
I think the beauty of it is that, people have lots of different ways to build a company. Like there's no one right way to build a company. And the lovely thing is that there are tools out there now to support whatever kind of company is right for that company. Sorry, Marcus, I cut you off.
No, all good. All good. No, what I just wanted to add here is that I think the overall interest for payroll also increased a lot in the last years to also gain more visibility, because I mean, as Marcelo also mentioned, like, even if you have local entities, you run the payroll locally, right? And usually it's like a super fragmented market. So every single entity, if you're a global company, is usually running their own local payroll. Then they get the data back in any way, can be even via email, via spreadsheets or whatever. And to centralize this data and get a complete overview here to also give you the possibility to take actions, to optimize payments, to optimize maybe benefits, etc. I think that's really something that shifted in the last years, and where we also see like a movement in the traditional payroll that is getting more and more digital and more modern, let's say it in that way.
I think someone brought up FX or foreign exchange risk earlier, which I think would be good to speak about. Like, what are the different approaches you can take to manage this, and is there anything, sorry, that companies should particularly watch out for here?
Yeah, I mean, at least from our side, right? Like, I think what we see most companies doing is like, you want to know how much the FX is before you have to put the money into the system, right? So like, you know, for everyone that's here on this call, right? Like the rest of the panelists, like when their underlying customers need to pay, you want to know exactly what the FX is going to be. And then when the money goes out, that you want to ensure, kind of what Marcelo was saying, like you want to ensure that the money that you promised the individual, the entire amount is going to be there. And I think the only way that you can do that is by basically working with companies that can take essentially payment at a certain date and say, hey, this is a locked FX that I'm going to give you, so that when the money goes out, that you know exactly how much money is going out. And you also know how much your underlying customers need to put into the system, so that there's no discrepancy, right? Because that's what bites a lot of people, where there's just, even if it's a few pennies, it's really frustrating from a reconciliation perspective. So you really have to work to get that right. It'd be interesting to see what folks on the call think, like in terms of what you guys are doing to improve FX for your customers.
So one of the biggest problems that comes with it is if I'm an employee and you know I get my salary, I get my pay slip, even if there's one wrong cent, I'm not talking $1, I'm talking $10, talking one wrong cent, it is an immediate trigger for me to think this whole thing is wrong, right? You know, someone is messing up, the transfer is messed up, the payslip is wrong, you know, something is fundamentally broken. And it's not like people dissociate that as an employee, that those are two different things. No, I'm the receiver of something that is owed, contractually speaking, and did not arrive as expected. And in the cases where it's a contractor or a freelancer, even in that case, it is, even though it can be explained through banks being banks, it is a breach of almost trust. You know, we agreed on a certain amount, and that's not what I'm getting. And the having to have the conversation that leads to an excuse is very poor. It's the worst kind of relationship you can possibly have. And in the same way, having to deal with, you know, the effects and transfers and all that, and let alone, let's not even talk about the inflation in certain countries, that they experience hyperinflation when you decide to, you know, send your money abroad. Whatever arrives may be totally different, as Robin was very well saying. Like, you have to try to be as, you know, as accurate as possible, given certain, you know, limitations. And even to us in certain countries, it is not an exact science. You have to, you know, overshoot it to make sure that you're locked in tight with the cash. Because in the same way that for labor laws and taxes, the world, it's not global, it's fragmented. It's even worse when we talk about currency. It's even worse when we talk about banks and their processes. So in many cases, it's about, planning very much well in advance, making sure that you're well suited locally to make that payment, either through of course, a partner, or in a very edge case where you have to have a local bank account for it. But for, I would dare say 99.5% of companies, that even if they're like 5 people a business, they can go run in 5 different countries and opening bank accounts there, especially for a company that doesn't even exist locally.
Marcelo,
And I think,
oh, sorry, did I interrupt someone?
Just wanted to add one point here, sorry. I think a great example here also how you can solve it is if you give at the end also to the employees some benefits, can be a digital wallet, for example, in the system, because for example, even our companies, we have employees in Brazil, and the Brazilian real is going up and down all the time. So adding a contract in USD and providing that to a digital wallet helps a lot, that the employees can decide by their own whenever they want to take the money to their local bank account or not. So I think giving these benefits on a global scale is also important to give benefits to the employees itself.
Yeah, and I think, if you do hire globally, you need to understand not just kind of your company level compensation strategy, but what is the FX strategy that fits into that. A lot of companies will, for example, have salary bands for a given level, and sometimes they're localized, sometimes they're not. But perhaps, for example, all of the salary bands are listed in dollars, and people probably need to understand, again, to kind of the trust point, or transparency, are you going to lock a rate for the purposes of what they will receive, dealing with candidates and trying to, manage expectations there around negotiation of compensation. I do think that for global companies, FX is like a critical part of the compensation strategy and how you compensate locally as well.
So I just wanted to bring up Marcelo's point on freelancers and contractors, because as a former freelancer, I know how often it is to have missed payments, late payments, and again, to the point about trust, you don't want to work for that company again if they're not going to pay you on time with the right amount. So how do you actually keep it smooth when it comes to paying freelancers and contractors in different countries?
Well, it is, as Robin explained, or provide a brief intro to it. It is, at least from my perspective, it is the employer's responsibility to make sure that the arrangement is met, because it's very easy for us to say, look, yeah, so you asked for $5,000 for a task, and sure, I'm going to pay it, and I'm going to go to my bank and issue a transfer. And meanwhile, what's going to land is probably an unwarranted FX transaction. Your cash was transacted to a different currency just because you're in a different country, which making a lot of assumptions. Maybe you just want to get your money still in the same currency, original currency. And then the fees on the transfer, and then the fees on top of the FX. And once this is done, good luck going to the bank and asking for the money back, because it's not just not going to happen. And so on top of course, using a partner that has a good network across the world that can secure and offer, payment rails that allow you to be, have a trustworthy relationship. It is always, at the end of the day, the employer's responsibility that that transfer is properly funded. And speaking from an employee or contractor or freelancer standpoint, people should not accept less unless, aforementioned, unless discussed and say, well, yeah, there's going to be a transaction fee and I'm going to have to cope with it. If not, then it fundamentally needs to stay within the employer side or whoever partner is arranging for that. Now, saying this, it's almost like a blank statement, but it requires a lot of work. Robin knows this very well, that to ensure that $1 goes from point A to point B, it's quite a lot of stuff, and that's the kind of work that companies like us do and have to ensure at the end of the day. But as far as an employer goes, it should not be debatable on what gets paid and how much as well.
Yeah.
What I was going to say is like, this is about my money, right? Like when it's your money, then it's like all these things that Marcel was talking about, right? First of all, give me all of my money, not a piece of my money, a part of my money. Don't tell me why you didn't give a little bit of it back, right? So one, I want all of my money. Then I want my money as fast as humanly possible, right? So like, if there is a way to get my money faster, I want to think about that option. And the last one is like, I want the money the way that I want it, right? So like, if we think about, Brazil, if you're in Brazil, you want to get that payment through Pix, you want to get it as fast as possible, and you want to make sure that there's no FX on it. But at the same time, if you're getting paid in China, you might say, you know what? I don't want you to put it in my bank account. I want you to put it into my Alipay wallet, right? Like, I think it's really important that we, first of all, the main thing is reliability and ensuring that there's a lot of trust in the system. But once you have that, I think for contractors and freelancers, it's always about how can I get it as fast as possible in the place that I want it so I can spend that money as quickly as I can, right? And I think like it's interesting to see because like you see it with Uber drivers and Lyft drivers, especially here in the US, right? Like almost all other markets have a really fast way of getting people money, yet in the US, we don't. And so, then Uber ends up in a situation where they basically allow a driver to pay more money so that they can get their money faster. And I think that's an interesting thing to think about, which means that like when you're a freelancer and a contractor, a lot of times you're living essentially like job to job, paycheck to paycheck. And it's really important that you build that trust and that speed and the optionality to make sure that you make their life as easy and simple as possible. And I mean, that's essentially what you guys are doing as well on this panel.
No, I think especially here, I mean, the payment is the last step in the process, right? You get the invoice in, and then the payment is really the last step. But what I had a lot of times before, and that was also our initial idea back in time, is to remove this black box, because like even when you just send the invoice in as a freelancer, you don't know what's happening until you receive the money, or maybe someone is rejecting the invoice. Even in the company, the invoice as kind of a ping pong in between the teams. It's going to whatever needs approval from the team lead, then to accounting, then they maybe pay it. And I think at the end, it's about the visibility, and payment for sure is a big piece of that. But even removing the black box before and giving, again, the tools on the hand here to create this visibility is really important, especially if you are working on a global scale. And I think it's not always easy because you cannot go to the office and say, look, guys, I want my money. You're maybe in a different time zone, in a different continent. And especially then, I think it's really important to remove this black box and give them the visibility that they need.
Since we were talking about kind of distributed teams and the kind of remote work revolution, I thought it might be interesting to speak a bit about, for companies that haven't already expanded internationally, there are these two different models. Sabrina, you mentioned fully distributed or hub model. What are the differences between the two, and what are the kind of payroll implications for both of them?
Yeah, so I think, again, even within that question, there are a couple of different ways to think about it. I think it partly depends on, your company's kind of culture and working practices and what you want to try and do. If, for example, you are already going to the step of saying, we are in this one geography, we are opening up a second geography, and we want to have a very significant number of people in that geography, and say it's going to be hybrid working, there is going to be an office, people are going to be centralized around that. By virtue of going down that route, it's quite likely that it quite likely means that like your operations in that country are going to be quite significant. The process of, you know, renting office space and things, you know, there's a decent likelihood that that's the kind of investment that a company is making when they have a reason to be in a particular geography, whether it's to better serve clients, whether it's to have access to a particular talent market, that is more likely to lead to the establishment of an entity there. And in those cases, you know, it's quite typical if you're going down that route to then kind of make the adjacent investments into more local expertise to create that kind of holistic experience. But equally, a lot of companies don't operate like this and take like a more remote model, and it's more a case of you know, we want to hire these functions or these people, and we are relatively agnostic as to like the geography that they're in. And in that event, you kind of want to just eliminate as much administration as possible, and, you know, have as simple a setup as possible. It really kind of depends on what your reason is to going to a particular country, you know, whether it's opportunistic, you know, you're just taking advantage of perhaps a particular person or a particular kind of group of people who are there for talent reasons. If you have a very strategic reason to go to a particular country, I think then you're more likely to statistically end up having an entity, a hub, an office, and all of the things that go on there. But as we said a couple of times, there are a lot of different ways to run great businesses.
Yeah, I think the other kind of interesting aspect of distributed teams now is digital nomads who, you know, may spend a couple of months of the year in different countries. And how do you actually manage that from a tax or payroll perspective? Like, has regulation caught up with digital nomads yet, or what is the situation?
It definitely has not. I think we can say that for the better part, regulation has not caught up with digital nomads. I think part of it that's really, really important is to have a clear set of expectations. There are simply some companies that will not support this. And, you know, if, for example, you are a company that is remote, but you are not supporting digital nomads, I think it's really important to be extremely clear and upfront, not just with your employees, but also with your contractors, that is your approach. And if you are a company that has remote people and you do support people to work from anywhere or to become digital nomads, it's important to be clear, are there any limitations that you put around that? Quite common, you see companies like restrict it to say 60 days or 90 days, feeling like, you know, you're not going to get into too much. This is not tax advice, by the way, but like a lot of companies feel like they're not going to get into too much trouble if someone's out of a jurisdiction for that time. But then also, you know, what the obligation is for the employee to communicate that to the employer. There may be companies that are completely happy for people to move around, but that needs the visibility and understanding of where people are in order to be able to put that compliance around them. So there's a balance here between how much of like the onus a company is willing to take on versus how much they're going to policy and push onto the employee. But I think the most important thing is to have a view and to proactively communicate that view, because the worst example is to be on one end of the spectrum and then discover that your company is on the complete other end of interpretation as to how to support this.
Yeah. I was just thinking as well that in terms of payroll, it's not just about paying, it's about the kind of benefits side of things as well, as I think you mentioned earlier, Sabrina. And often it's kind of difficult to handle communication around this. Employees can get paid different benefits in different geographies. So how do you actually manage the communication around this, informing employees why they're getting a certain benefit, whereas Joe, who sits next to them, gets something different?
I think the most modern approach is that a lot of companies take a kind of a total compensation approach, whereby, you know, let's say that they have a way in which they pay people in a certain function, and perhaps they localize salaries, perhaps they don't. But a company has to like make a decision on, you know, what is kind of the total compensation that they want to deliver to like a particular geography. And then again, it all comes down to communication, being proactive about communicating to people. In these geographies, we do this because we think this is a holistic package. In these geographies, we don't. A common example I see is a lot of companies that are, and I'm based in the UK, as you can probably hear from my voice, that are UK based, set up in the UK, and they go and they open up an office in the US. Very, very common. Probably one of the most common, you know, dual nationality like setups that companies have. And in the UK, it's not necessarily common, especially in smaller companies, that healthcare will be part of a package. You know, it's seen as like a fairly premium benefit in a lot of cases. It has tax implications, etc. A lot of companies won't do this. In the US, however, it is table stakes. It is just like the absolute minimum basics that there will be healthcare as part of any kind of employment package. And that's a reflection on, you know, the different societal and governmental setups in those two countries, as well as like cultural expectations. And again, the main thing is just to be really proactive about communicating this, especially if there are differences as to why people get paid different amounts. If you have an engineer in the US and an engineer in the UK, assume that they're talking about what they're paid, about, you know, what benefits and things they are offered, and that they're going to discover where there are differences. And if you do not get ahead of communicating to them why there are differences, the standard thing that happens is that people jump to the worst possible interpretation. Generally speaking, US salaries are much higher than they are in the UK and Europe, partly attached to like the cost of living in that jurisdiction. Many companies that are you know, European would probably go bust if paying US salaries to everyone in European jurisdictions. There are very good real reasons why many companies do not do that, but expect to be asked the question. This isn't to say you have to go all the way down the end to full salary transparency, but I think there is an onus on businesses now to be much more transparent than they used to be. Not necessarily about exactly what people are being paid, but how pay and benefits are calculated, how it differs or doesn't differ in different parts of your business.
Even the difference between gross and net payment really depends to the country. I mean, a good example again is the Ukraine, where they work in a private entrepreneur setup. So our employees, they pay 5% tax overall, and that's all. So for that, you for sure have a way higher net income, but the gross income might be a bit lower. So I think like this global setup, you really have to take care. I mean, for sure, you have to be open to communication, as Sabrina said. But I think the benefits will never be the same globally. It's hard to manage.
And there's the only thing I have to add, both of you added literally everything, is that we cannot anymore make assumptions that the person on the receiving end even understands what they're seeing. And the reason why I'm saying this is in many countries, there's a vast majority of people working remote. They're not local. They either moved in, they used to be digital nomads, or decided to just, you know, set some roots and in that country, which could also mean that they're looking at, for instance, a payslip for the first time. They're looking at, you know, compensation package as far as, for instance, benefits go for the first time. And so if you have someone going from the US to Europe, and all of a sudden they're, you know, they're in a country where you don't have a private healthcare plan. Why is this? Like, is it legal? Can this be done? And the opposite is also true. In a matter of, you know, the world is not what it used to be, where, you know, this one person is from this country, so they sit in their own box and that's it. So there's a, you know, it's a right to have transparency and have information, because even though there are many use cases where someone all of a sudden is receiving a salary and thinking, well, so how about the pension plans and who's paying for that? Because I get my net, but I'm used to be pension plan. Well, it probably does not exist in that country. And there's an added requirement on top of, having some standardization, or at least within a locally, meaning which is the capacity to just have transparently, this is what is done, and the information, this is what is done in this country, this is why it's done. And as a company, you may choose to offer certain benefits to a certain geography, for instance, because it's one, either just customary, or second, because it's super cheap, and everyone wins because it's tax deductible, so on and so forth.
Great. Well, I'm just going to pick up some questions from the audience. Maria says, can you address the delays aspect of the last question? So this was about freelancers. How do you ensure you get paid on time and chasing payments doesn't become an additional job?
I mean, I think one thing I think is helpful is that, especially when you have contractors that you may not know, it's helpful to sometimes be where a lot of times payments get stuck is at the very end, when you're basically doing a sanctions check. You're looking to make sure that whoever you're paying is someone that you should pay and can pay. So something that you can do is you can basically run that person through before you actually send them the payment, right? So you can actually verify who you're paying beforehand, and I think that smooths that out a lot more. I mean, you obviously want to be working with a system that is reliant and that can get you the money from point A to point B in the time that you expect it to go. But I think where we see a lot of things getting caught up from a payroll perspective is essentially that, right? Like, especially when we talk about freelancers and contractors, you have less of a working relationship with them, especially in the beginning. And so as a result, what we're noticing is, like, just at that moment when you send out, if you had just done a pre-check 2 or 3 days before, you would have said, hey, there's something that seems off here, and you would have fixed it, right? So at least that's what we've seen, where you can kind of speed it up and ensure that, like, people get paid on the day that they're supposed to get paid.
Yeah, and I would also add, particularly if you are a contractor or a freelancer who is simply doing invoicing in like a very traditional method, you send an invoice to like a particular person, that person runs it through whatever payments, internal process they have. As a contractor or freelancer, whomever you are working with, ask the questions really far up front as to what their process is for making payments for invoices. Do those invoices need to go to a particular person or email address, for example? Do they do a payment run once a week? If so, on what day, so that you know that you're getting your invoice in time to make it into that payment run? Do they need a purchase order? I would generally, there are platforms out there that some companies use that that do like a really great job of streamlining this from like the company perspective. But obviously, if you're dealing with a company that does not have one of these setups in place, I think that it's just really important to kind of get ahead of what a company's invoice payment process is, just to make sure that you don't accidentally do something that's going to create delays. Because I agree with everyone here, the onus should be on the company to get the money to someone on time. The sad reality is that doesn't always happen, and sort of as an individual, for like your own benefits, would definitely kind of get ahead of understanding what is the system that you need to navigate with a particular client to make sure that that there isn't a disadvantage on your side.
Thanks very much for that. Another thing we haven't spoken about, I think, yet is paying people in preferred payment methods. So how do you actually streamline that if you've got contractors, digital nomad in South Africa, employees back in UK or whatever, and they all want to be paid by different methods? How do you actually manage that?
There are sometimes the number of permutations based on the country and also the person is usually, it goes up until the legally allowed. And in some countries, for instance, the salary payments can be done in multiple currencies, or even contractually changed. For instance, someone doesn't want to get their salary in dollars, wants to get it in crypto. And in some countries, of course, this is possible. It's allowed, it's legal. And other countries, you have to work within the parameters, meaning you can pay directly in crypto, but you can say, here's the salary in local currency, but actually the transaction is going to be done within this FX with this currency, be it crypto, therefore can be taxed and properly locally taxed. To us, in our case, we abstract all this so that, you know, the countries, the employer just focuses on the paying either the contractor or freelancer or the employee in whatever has been agreed and is legally. For us to do that, we have to rely on really strong partners in order to do that, because it's really complex. In the same way that just the employment and, you know, the sustaining the contractor or the freelancer is a massive network of permutations based on legal compliance. There's this whole world within where Robin is inserted that is also taken sometimes even to the more extreme, because in many jurisdictions, you doing something like that can be criminal liability, and so there's no magic sauce. I wish that there was something, but it is possible. What I want to say, it is possible. There are some limitations given geography, but it is possible to delve into it.
How do you think freelancers or employees actually respond to that? So if a company says, like, I can only pay in X methods, how do employees typically react?
The feedback that I've seen coming through us in that way is, so if it's an employee that is typically well established, right? Because your expectations are usually bound to a contract, negotiated through a contract, and unless it's someone arriving to a country and needing a certain different accommodation, just seldomly the case, that can be somehow sorted at the contracting time, meaning signing the contract. As far as contractors and freelancers, it's a bit more easy. Why? Because there's not they're not so bound to the local, only the local legislation. Usually the link is between two different parties, and there's nothing preventing one party to have having a bank account or a wallet in a partner that receives the money in however form they've agreed upon. We see more and more that this is not just a 1 in 1,000 cases, but it's becoming more and more the case that people are asking to have multiple types of receiving their cash, not just different currencies, but also forms like crypto and similar, and then you start adding stuff like stock and other forms of compensation. But it's becoming more and more the case in the same way that people are, we're becoming this global, economy or global employment world or contracting world. It's forcing its way into the payments, which is a very slow moving world and has to be built upon. But it is not anymore just an option. It is demanded by quite a lot of people. And given the examples of Brazil, Argentina, you name it, it becomes even more so mandatory that people have a way out other than seeing their money evaporate in like 2 seconds.
I mean, what we see on top always is, even if one currency is not supported, usually, I mean, you still have like 2-3 big currencies, right? Like GBP, USD, and the euro. And if a currency is not supported, usually the USD is always an accepted payment method. But I totally agree that it comes more and more demanding on the contractor side, on the employment side, to have different type of payments here as well. Yeah, especially stock options. I think that's something, if you go, and we are all from startup So stock options, I think, or virtual stock options is something that is also well taken.
Interesting. Are there any other kind of trends in payroll that we're going to see over the next few years, or anything else that is going to become really important?
I think there are lots of things we would like to see, that we would hope to see. Certainly, a better global framework to kind of better to work better with the new ways of working that people have, and the additional flexibility, whether it's on the payment side, things like a 9-day fortnight, all of like the different things that are coming into like the new world of work. I think a lot of countries' legislation just has a lot of catching up to do. But yeah, one big trend that we're seeing, certainly since kind of COVID hit, is that the need for companies to like digitize what has traditionally been an extremely analog process, emailing things back and forth, usually with like an outsourcing bureau, is probably like still the most common way of running payroll globally. And so in terms of like the biggest good change, that's definitely the biggest good change that I think is well on the way, and that even not just the newest, youngest businesses, but older businesses are also starting to adopt and digitize these processes. But the change I would like to see is certainly one from like the legislation standpoint, both in terms of like employment law and the tax treatment of people who do want to take advantage of the greater flexibility.
Any other wishes from our panelists?
I have one thing to add. Like one of the things in the last 2 years, maybe 3, that we've tried to be quite involved with is help local governments understand what all this means, right? What paying people abroad means. There is tremendous will from every single geography, every single government to capture the tax paying dollars or local currency of people that want to move in and settle down and start getting their payments locally, because it helps everyone. It helps themselves, the governments, the countries, but it definitely resides on everyone involved, be it the people on the receiving end, but also us that have tremendous role within this space to help drive, the future, the labor laws, the tax laws, corporative laws in such a way that is useful for the future of work. And they do require our help and opinions, because what we've seen personally is that European Union, for instance, they're super eager to start standardizing this across Europe, but it's really hard. And for them being on the outside, if we don't get involved, then it's going to take 10 more years than it should have. So my wish is that, of course, we can all benefit from this advance, and that we move towards a society that is more equitable, but also that everyone that can help does help.
Cool. Well, I think we're going to wrap up here because we're nearly out of time. So thanks to everyone who joined in the audience, and sorry if I couldn't get to your question in the limited time that we had. Huge thanks also to our partner Nium for their support, and also to our panelists for their insights. Huge thanks for joining. But yeah, hope to see you all for the next Sifted Talks. I think my colleague is going to be dropping in a link to the chat box now in case you want to have a look at what's coming up. But have a good rest of the day, and thanks very much again.
Thanks a lot. Have a good day.